Nobody worried about Gen X. That's not an insult. That's practically their origin story. They came home to empty houses and learned to make their own dinner. They watched their parents' marriages come apart in the 1970s and 80s and quietly concluded that adults were not quite as reliable as advertised. They grew up in the years before helicopter parenting, before participation trophies, before anyone thought to ask a child how they were feeling and genuinely wait for the answer. They were handed a key and told to figure it out. And they did. They always did. That's the thing about Gen X that gets missed in every conversation about generations. This is the group that learned self-sufficiency so early, so completely, that they stopped knowing how to ask for anything else. The world called them slackers, cynics, the forgotten generation, wedged between two giants, the boomers who reshape culture and the millennials who get all the think pieces. But that label of forgettable, that might be the most revealing thing about them. Because a generation raised without applause learns, very early, to perform without an audience. This is the psychology of Generation X. If you were Gen X, something in what I just said probably landed quietly. Not dramatically, not with tears, just a small, internal recognition, the kind you've spent decades being very good at not showing. That composure, that ability to feel something and reveal almost none of it, is not a personality quirk. It is a learned survival response, built brick by brick over a childhood that asked you to be more capable than was fair, more independent than was safe, and more stoic than was human. You're not closed off. You are not emotionally unavailable. You are someone whose emotional availability was never sufficiently invited. And once you understand the environment that built you, the patterns start to make a different kind of sense. Let's start with the latchkey door. Psychologists talk about something called the good enough parent, the caregiver who doesn't have to be perfect, just present enough that a child develops a secure base. A place inside them that feels safe. A voice that says, someone is coming. You don't have to handle this alone. For millions of Gen X children, that voice was quiet. Not because their parents were cruel, most weren't, but because the 1970s and 80s reshaped the family in ways nobody fully planned for. Divorce rates doubled. Two-income households became a necessity, not a choice. Women entered the workforce en masse, which was necessary and right, but the culture didn't build the support structures to catch the children left behind. So the children came home to empty houses. And here's the part that matters psychologically. Children don't interpret an empty house as a social or economic condition. They interpret it personally. The child sitting alone at the kitchen table doesn't think, my parents are navigating systemic pressures. The child thinks, in a wordless language of felt experience, I am on my own. And when that conclusion gets repeated enough, something shifts in the developing nervous system. The child stops waiting to be rescued. They build competence in its place. They learn to cook, to manage boredom, to solve small problems alone, to not need. Hyperindependence, the hallmark trait of Gen X, doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from adaptation. The trouble is that adaptations built for survival in childhood don't automatically dismantle themselves in adulthood. The person who learned at 9 that needing people is risky is still, at 45, a little bit suspicious of needing people. Not because they're cold, because the lesson was written early in permanent ink. There's a specific kind of loneliness that has no obvious wound attached to it. It's the loneliness of doing something well and having nobody particularly notice. Gen X grew up in households where emotional expression was, at best, restrained. The parenting philosophy of the era, shaped by parents who had survived the Depression, the war, decades of genuine scarcity, was largely, provide materially, don't dramatize emotionally. Children were fed, clothed, housed. That was the contract. The idea that a child also needed to be seen, praised, emotionally narrated through their experience. That was not yet part of the cultural vocabulary. What this produces psychologically is a child who learns to measure their worth through output rather than being. If you never received acknowledgement simply for existing, you learn to earn acknowledgement through achievement, through competence, through not complaining, through being, above all, useful. Psychologists call this achievement-contingent self-worth, the internal equation that ties your value as a person to what you are currently producing. It is an exhausting way to move through a life, and it is remarkably common in Gen X. Many Gen Zers describe a persistent, low-level feeling that they are never quite doing enough. That rest is somehow dishonest. That slowing down is the same as falling behind. That if they stopped being useful, something important would slip away: respect, identity, the right to take up space. The applause they never received as children didn't disappear. It went underground. And from underground, it became the engine that never quite turns off. In the late 1980s and early 90s, a cultural movement emerged from Gen X that the rest of the world found deeply confusing. Grunge, slacker culture, a studied, almost deliberate disengagement from the idea that things meant anything. Flannel shirts, irony as a first language. The posture of someone who has already seen through the whole thing and can't quite summon the energy to pretend otherwise. Older generations called it laziness. Pop psychologists called it nihilism. What it actually was, behaviorally speaking, was something more precise: preemptive self-protection. When a generation watches institutions fail, marriages, corporations, governments, the simple promise that effort produces reward, the psychologically rational response is to lower your investment before you lose it. If you don't care about the outcome can't take anything from you. Cynicism, in this context, isn't an attitude. It's a defense. Attachment researchers have a term for a similar pattern in early childhood: avoidant attachment. The child who has learned that reaching toward connection brings inconsistent results begins to look like they don't want connection at all. They seem self-contained, comfortable alone, unimpressed by the people around them. But beneath that surface, and this is what the attachment research consistently shows, is not indifference. It is a hunger that has learned to disguise itself, a need that has taught itself to look like its opposite. Gen X cynicism was never about not caring. It was the armor of a generation that cared enormously and had been given very little reason to show it. But here's the part that almost never makes it into the conversation about Gen X. All of it, the independence, the self-reliance, the composure, the ability to handle almost anything without making a sound, served them. It genuinely did. In a world that wasn't going to hold their hand, they built hands capable of holding themselves. The question isn't whether those adaptations were impressive. They were. The question is what it cost them, and whether, at this point in their lives, the armor is still necessary, or whether it has simply become the only way they know how to stand. There is a specific injury that comes from being overlooked, not mistreated, not directly harmed, simply not noticed. Gen X has been called the forgotten generation so many times that the phrase has become almost a joke. Sandwiched between the enormous cultural footprint of the baby boomers and the endless discourse about millennials, Gen X occupies a strange position in the cultural conversation. They are present, competent, doing most of the work, and almost never the subject of the story. For a generation already primed to expect invisibility, this pattern has a particular sting. Psychologists who study what's called recognition hunger, the deep human need to be seen, not just tolerated, note that chronic invisibility produces a specific kind of identity fragility. Not the fragility that looks like fragility, the fragility that looks like complete self-sufficiency. The person who says, "I don't need recognition," with such conviction that they've almost convinced themselves. Many Gen Zers entered midlife with the quiet, unexamined feeling that they had done everything right and somehow still didn't quite count. That the world had moved on to new concerns before it finished acknowledging the ones they carried. That feeling doesn't always announce itself. It arrives sideways, as a faint irritation when younger colleagues get praise for things Gen X invented, as a tiredness that sleep doesn't fix, as the strange experience of being the most reliable person in every room and somehow still feeling just slightly like a ghost in it. At some point in their 40s, many Gen Zers found themselves doing something no other generation has had to do in quite the same way: caring for everyone simultaneously. Their children, millennials and Gen Z, needed more emotional scaffolding than any previous generation of parents have been asked to provide. The culture shifted. Good parenting now required emotional attunement, active listening, therapeutic language, consistent presence. All things Gen X had not received and were now being asked to give without a blueprint, without having seen it modeled. At the same time, their parents, the baby boomers, began aging. Doctors' appointments, financial decisions, the slow and often painful work of watching the people who once seemed indestructible become vulnerable. Gen X stepped in. They always step in. In the middle of all of this, they were also running organizations, managing careers in an economy that kept shifting, processing the cultural whiplash of a world that changed faster than anyone promised. And this is the part that often goes unnoticed, doing most of it without ever having learned how to ask for support. The generation raised to be self-sufficient now found itself as the structural support beam of two other generations, holding everything up, telling nobody it was heavy. Psychologists who work with midlife adults often describe a specific presentation in Gen X clients. They're deeply competent, visibly exhausted, and genuinely surprised when someone asks how they're doing and actually wants to know. The question lands strangely. They're not used to it being aimed at them. Here is where the Gen X story gets interesting, because somewhere in their 40s and 50s, something begins to shift. Not dramatically. Gen X doesn't do dramatic, but quietly, internally, in a way that things shift for people who have spent a long time being very careful not to need anything. A question starts forming. It doesn't arrive as a crisis. It arrives more like a thought that won't quite leave. Is this it? Not in despair. In genuine, careful curiosity. The children who once needed everything from them are becoming more independent. The parents they cared for are gone or going. The career that once required complete dedication is revealing its limitations. And Gen X, for perhaps the first time, finds itself with a small, unfamiliar amount of space. The people who were never asked what they needed are slowly beginning to ask themselves. This is the psychological work of Gen X midlife. Not reinvention, but excavation. Reaching back below all that competence and composure and finding out what's still there. What they actually want, separate from what they were required to provide. What softness they might have preserved underneath all those years of necessary hardness. The generation that was raised without applause is learning, slowly and with some suspicion, that rest is not the same as failure. That needing people is not the same as weakness. That the self-sufficiency that saved them in childhood does not have to be the only tool available in adulthood. They're not becoming different people. They're becoming more fully themselves, reaching, perhaps for the first time, the parts that had to wait. For Gen X, control has always been the regulation mechanism, not control over others. The pressure doesn't disappear. It accumulates. And what frequently happens in the quiet spaces Gen X rarely allows themselves is a bone-deep exhaustion that has nowhere to go because there is no language for it and no practice of giving it somewhere to land. Many Gen Zers find their feelings arrive sideways, not as emotion, as body. A tension in the shoulders that never fully releases. A tiredness that sleep doesn't resolve. An irritability with small things that doesn't make sense until you look at what the large things have been. The body keeps the account even when a mind refuses to open the ledger. And this, more than any other single thing, may be the most important piece of psychology about Gen X. They are not unfeeling. They feel everything. They simply never received permission to show it. And a feeling that has no permission to be expressed doesn't dissolve. It finds another door. So here is what I want to say to Generation X. Not what you should do, just what is true. You are the generation that held things together when nobody was watching. You built competence out of solitude. You kept going when the map ran out. You handed to your children the emotional vocabulary you were never given, often without knowing how, often while running on empty. And you did it without asking for credit, partly out of dignity, partly because you were never entirely sure credit was something you were allowed to want. The independence that defined you was real. The resilience was real. And it came from something real, A childhood that required more of you than it should have, earlier than it should have, with less support than you deserved. None of that was weakness. None of it was failure. All of it made sense, given the soil. But you're not 9 years old anymore, sitting at a kitchen table, waiting for someone to come home. And the door you learned to lock from the inside. The one that kept you safe when safety wasn't guaranteed doesn't have to stay locked just because it always has been. You don't have to perform competence for an audience that isn't there. You don't have to earn the right to be tired. You don't have to hold everything together all the time in silence to justify being here. You already justified it. If this felt like something, leave in the comments. Not analysis. Just, did this land? And if you know a Gen Zer who has spent their whole life being the capable one, share this with them. Quietly. The way they'd want it. Subscribe to Psychology Explainer for more of this. No quick fixes. No life hacks. Just honest psychology explained slowly.